everybody, welcome back to room 227, West Clermont High School. I'm your anatomy teacher, Mr. Grippa, and this is going to be quiz number 5, review for the bone tray quizzes, and this is the torso, pelvic girdle, spinal column, and the ribs. All right, so here's what we're going to do here. Let's start with the ribs. I'll grab my little partner. The bone here in the middle of your chest is known as the sternum. The sternum is actually made up of 3 separate bones. We have the manubrium of the sternum, the body of the sternum, and this little guy down here that you use your 2 fingers to find in CPR. That's known as the xiphoid process. All of this cartilage here that attaches the ribs to the sternum is known as costal cartilage, and your ribs are divided into 3 categories. You have true ribs, false ribs, and floating ribs. The top 7 are true ribs, and we can tell because they each have their own piece of costal cartilage that attaches them to the sternum. The next 3, which would be ribs 8, 9, and 10, are false ribs because they share a piece of costal cartilage that connects them to the sternum, these 3. And then the very bottom 2, 11 and 12, would be considered the floating ribs because, as you can see, they do not have any cartilage that attaches them to the sternum. So we go down with, we'll take a look at the pelvic girdle. Here we have an example, and the structures for the pelvic girdle will be the 3 bones that are in each half of the pelvis. The ilium, which makes the large paddle here, the pubic bone, which is up front, and then this down at the bottom is what everyone considers the butt bone, would be the ischium. Structures that are associated with the pelvis, we have the cartilaginous disc here making the semi-movable joint. This is the pubic symphysis. We have the obturator foramen. The greater sciatic notch is this groove right here. We have the obturator foramen, this large hole here, and then this would be the ischial spine. Across this ridge, this border here is known as the iliac crest. And then here, making up the rest of the pelvis, would be the sacrum, the fused vertebrae at the bottom of the vertebral column, and then our tailbone, or coccyx, down here. And this is isolated without the rest of the pelvis. We have the sacrum and coccyx right here. Moving up to the vertebrae, we'll start at the top. Vertebrae are divided into 3 sections. We have the cervical vertebrae, which are the 7 in the neck. We have the next 12 are all thoracic vertebrae. They each have a pair of ribs attached to them. The bottom 5 are then the lumbar vertebrae and the lower back. And now we'll talk about how to distinguish between those 3 individually if they are disarticulated. So first, the cervical. All cervical vertebrae are slightly smaller. They have a small body, which is this center portion here, where the intervertebral discs will be found. And as you can see, they each have 3 foramina, or holes. So here we have the large vertebral foramen, and then in each transverse process, there's another foramen for the cervical nerves as they go down the neck. So all cervical vertebrae have 3 holes, 3 foramen. The lumbar vertebrae, let's go thoracic. The thoracic vertebrae are next. They are a little larger than the cervicals. They're not as big as the lumbar, and they have a longer transverse spine. And on a real one, these are plastic, but on the real one, you can see a fossa over here for the rib, so you can tell where the rib articulates with each of the thoracic vertebrae. They have usually a wider span, the transverse process stick out further, and the spine of the vertebrae usually point in a downward fashion. The lumbar vertebrae are the largest. They have a very large body, short transverse process, and their spine sticks usually more posteriorly instead of inferiorly. And the transverse spine, you can see, are much smaller. There is no fossa for the articulation of the rib, and that's how we can tell the difference. So here's another example. This is another thoracic vertebrae. You can see the transverse process is longer, And if you take a close look, you can see the fossa for the articulation of the rib. Now let's talk about some very special vertebrae. We have the C1 and C2, the atlas and axis. They are unique because the way they articulate with each other, they make a pivoting joint and allow us to turn our heads. So C1, atlas, is this vertebrae here. As you can see, it also has 3 holes or 3 foramina, and this has no body to it. It has a very thin area where normally the body of a vertebrae would be. So this is the very unique atlas or C1 vertebrae, and its counterpart C2 or axis has a body, but it has this process that sticks straight up, and this sets it aside from all other cervical vertebrae. This is the C2, and it allows for that post process that sticks up, allows for the pivoting joint that we have in our neck. So you can tell this is the cervical vertebrae again. It has the body, and it does not have the large process that sticks straight up, whereas this one does, and this would be C2, the axis. And this one, again, C1 atlas, this holds up the skull. The skull will sit and articulate onto that vertebrae right there. This is the hyoid bone. It's the only disarticulated bone in the body, meaning it does not have a joint where it works up against another bone at all. It's freely floating in the body, surrounds the larynx or voice box. It gives a framework for your vocal folds. And the 2 components that we need here are the greater horn, which are the ends of the bone back here, and these small processes that stick up here would be the lesser horn of the hyoid bone. We can look on the torso. We can see the hyoid bone is right here. We get a little closer. The hyoid bone right here where your voice box would be, and again the lesser horn and the greater horn there in the back. Okay, that does it for the review for the bone tray quizzes. I hope these videos have been a help and that we do well on our quizzes. This has been your anatomy teacher, Mr. Grippa speaking, and thanks for tuning in.